Everyone laughed when Claire Bennett stepped into the ballroom. By the end of the night, none of them would remember what they had been laughing about. The Grand Crescent Hotel glittered like a palace above downtown Chicago. Crystal chandeliers spilled golden light across polished marble floors. Waiters drifted through the crowd carrying silver trays filled with champagne flutes, while a jazz quartet played softly beneath the constant hum of conversations. It was the kind of place where success was measured by designer labels, private memberships, and the names printed on invitation lists. Claire paused just inside the entrance. For a brief moment, she considered turning around. The familiar scent of expensive perfume and polished wood pulled memories from places she had spent years trying to bury. Her fingers tightened around the small evening clutch in her hand. The emerald green dress she wore was elegant but understated, a quiet contrast to the extravagant gowns around her. She wasn't here to compete. She wasn't here to prove anything. At least that was what she kept telling herself. Then someone recognized her. A woman near the bar leaned toward her companion and whispered something. Another guest turned. Then another. Within seconds, heads began turning across the room like falling dominoes. Claire knew exactly what they saw. Ethan Walker's ex-wife. The woman everyone assumed had disappeared after the divorce. The woman who had once attended events like this on Ethan's arm before becoming an uncomfortable chapter people preferred not to discuss. A small laugh escaped from somewhere behind her. Then another. The sound wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. Humiliation rarely announced itself. It arrived quietly, slipping beneath the skin like cold water. Claire lifted her chin and continued walking. Her heels clicked softly against the marble floor. She refused to look away. She refused to shrink. Across the ballroom, Ethan stood surrounded by investors and executives. His dark suit fit perfectly. His confident smile looked exactly the same as it had 3 years ago. Beside him stood Vanessa Cole, draped in a shimmering silver gown that caught every beam of light in the room. She laughed at something Ethan said, touching his arm as though the gesture belonged there. Ethan followed her gaze toward the entrance, toward Claire. For a second, surprise flickered across his face. Then it disappeared behind a practiced smile. Vanessa noticed next. Her expression changed immediately. Curiosity, recognition, satisfaction. Claire had seen that look before. It was the look people wore when they believed they had won. She continued toward the refreshment table, ignoring the whispers that seemed to follow her from every direction. The years had changed her in ways none of them could see. They saw a woman arriving alone. They saw someone who had lost. What they didn't see were the thousands of quiet mornings she spent rebuilding herself. The nights she worked until exhaustion. The moments she learned to trust her own reflection again. The ballroom grew louder around her. Laughter echoed beneath the chandeliers. Glasses clinked. Somewhere nearby, a photographer called for another picture. Yet Claire felt strangely detached from it all, as though she were watching someone else's life unfold from a distance. Her phone vibrated inside her clutch. The sudden movement startled her. She glanced down at the screen. A single message waited there. 3 simple words. "I'm almost there." Claire stared at the message for several seconds. Then, for the first time that evening, a faint smile touched her lips. The smile vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. Claire slipped her phone back into her clutch and drew a slow breath. Around her, the ballroom continued its elegant performance. Crystal light shimmered across polished surfaces. Conversations flowed as smoothly as the champagne being poured. Yet she could feel the invisible circle around her growing wider. People were not avoiding her out of kindness. They were avoiding her because she had become a story, and stories were far more entertaining from a distance. She reached for a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray. The cold condensation dampened her fingertips. It gave her something to focus on besides the eyes she felt following her every movement. 3 years ago, she would have been standing beside Ethan, smiling politely through introductions and business conversations she rarely enjoyed. Back then, she had known every important name in the room. Tonight, many of those same people pretended not to recognize her. It was remarkable how quickly loyalty faded when it was no longer profitable. Near one of the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago skyline, a group of women whispered behind carefully practiced smiles. Claire recognized 2 of them immediately. She had attended charity luncheons with them, shared dinners, celebrated birthdays. One of them caught her eye for a moment before looking away. The gesture hurt far more than open hostility ever could. Claire turned toward the skyline instead. Beyond the glass, thousands of city lights stretched into the darkness. The view reminded her why she had come. Not for Ethan. Not for the people who had chosen sides when the marriage ended. And certainly not for validation. She was here because hiding had become exhausting. For too long she had allowed other people to decide who she was. The failed wife. The forgotten ex. The woman who lost everything. The narrative had been convenient for everyone except her. A burst of laughter echoed from across the room. Claire glanced over and found Ethan at the center of attention. As always, he was telling a story, gesturing confidently while his audience leaned in. Vanessa stood beside him, radiant beneath the chandeliers, her silver gown sparkling every time she moved. They looked perfect together, at least from a distance. Then Ethan's gaze found Claire again. This time he did not look away. He lifted his champagne glass slightly, almost like a greeting, almost like a challenge. Claire felt her stomach tighten. Memories had a strange way of returning all at once. Sunday mornings in their old townhouse. Business trips. Empty promises disguised as reassurance. Long nights spent believing that if she just tried harder, loved harder, sacrificed a little more, everything would eventually be enough. It never had been. Someone approached her from the side. Claire turned and found a familiar face. Melissa Harper. One of the few people she genuinely liked during her years in Ethan's world. Melissa offered a cautious smile. Claire, I was hoping you might come tonight. The warmth in her voice felt unexpectedly comforting. I almost did not, Claire admitted. Melissa nodded knowingly. You are braver than most people here. Before Claire could answer, movement near the ballroom entrance drew attention from several guests. Another wave of arrivals was entering. The crowd briefly shifted its focus. Melissa followed the commotion and then lowered her voice. For what it is worth, people talk because they are curious. They expected you to disappear. Claire looked back toward the skyline. I know. Melissa studied her carefully. Then why do you seem so calm? Claire's fingers brushed against her clutch, against the phone resting inside, against the message she had read only minutes earlier. A faint smile returned to her lips. Because tonight is not unfolding the way they think it is. Across the ballroom, Ethan watched her from a distance. And for the first time all evening, Claire noticed something unexpected in his expression. It was not confidence. It was curiosity. Curiosity spread through Ethan far more quickly than he wanted to admit. From across the ballroom, he watched Claire speaking with Melissa Harper near the windows overlooking the city. She should have looked uncomfortable. She should have looked overwhelmed. Instead, she appeared calm. Not happy. Not nervous. Simply calm. It unsettled him more than he cared to acknowledge. Vanessa noticed his attention drifting. You are staring again, she said lightly, swirling the champagne in her glass. Ethan forced a smile. I was just surprised she showed up. Vanessa followed his gaze. Maybe she misses this life. The comment earned a few amused chuckles from the people standing nearby. Ethan laughed along with them, but something about the joke felt hollow. 3 years had passed since the divorce. In his mind, Claire belonged to another chapter. A completed chapter. One he rarely revisited unless someone else brought it up. Yet seeing her standing there tonight had disturbed the neat version of history he preferred to remember. Nearby, a group of investors approached. They greeted Ethan warmly, shaking hands and exchanging business updates. The annual charity gala was more than a social event. It was an opportunity. Deals were discussed beneath crystal chandeliers. Partnerships were formed over cocktails. Appearances mattered almost as much as numbers. Ethan understood that better than anyone. One of the investors, Richard Calloway, smiled knowingly. I hear the guest of honor is arriving later tonight. Ethan nodded. That is what everyone says. Alexander Sterling does not attend many public events these days. Ethan felt interest ripple through the group immediately. Alexander Sterling's name carried weight in every financial conversation. Billion-dollar acquisitions, strategic investments, quiet influence. The man seemed to appear only when something significant was about to happen. Ethan had spent months trying to secure an introduction through mutual contacts. Tonight could finally be the opportunity he needed. Across the room, Claire had become an afterthought again. The crowd's attention shifted toward more important topics. Or at least that was what Ethan assumed. Meanwhile, Claire stood near the windows, listening as Melissa filled her in on familiar faces. Who had changed careers? Who had relocated? who was pretending to be more successful than they actually were. The conversation was pleasant enough, but Claire's attention kept drifting toward the ballroom entrance. Every few minutes, she found herself glancing toward the doors. Melissa eventually noticed. "Are you expecting someone?" Claire hesitated. "Maybe." Melissa raised an eyebrow, but did not press further. The answer seemed to satisfy her curiosity. A server passed carrying small plates of hors d'oeuvres. Claire accepted one absent-mindedly. She realized she had barely eaten all day. The anticipation sitting quietly beneath her calm exterior had made food seem irrelevant. She checked the time on her phone. 10 minutes had passed since the message. Somehow it felt much longer. Across the ballroom, Vanessa had gathered a small audience around her. She was describing plans for an upcoming wedding celebration. The word traveled quickly through nearby conversations. Wedding, engagement, venue, designer, guest list. Claire overheard fragments drifting through the room like pieces of music. Then Vanessa's laughter rang out clearly above the others. "Honestly, some people never move on," she said. Several guests laughed politely. Vanessa continued, "I cannot imagine spending years living in the past." The remark was delivered casually enough to maintain plausible deniability. Yet everyone understood exactly who it was aimed at. Claire lowered her eyes toward the sparkling water in her hand. Melissa's expression darkened immediately. "Ignore her." Claire exhaled softly. "I am." And she meant it. Because for the first time in years, the opinions floating around a ballroom no longer felt like the center of her world. Her phone vibrated once more. This time there was no message. Only a calendar notification she had forgotten to disable. Yet the sudden movement reminded her of the earlier text. "I am almost there." Claire slipped the phone away and looked toward the entrance again. At that exact moment, the ballroom doors opened, and several heads turned toward the arrival of another group of guests. The newcomers who entered the ballroom were not the people everyone had been expecting. The brief surge of attention faded almost immediately as guests returned to their conversations, disappointed that the mystery arrival was nothing more than another group of donors and corporate sponsors. The music resumed its place beneath the chatter. Glasses clinked. Laughter floated through the air. Yet the interruption had shifted something. The room felt restless now, as if everyone were unconsciously waiting for a larger moment to arrive. Vanessa certainly was. She stood near the center of the ballroom like someone accustomed to occupying the spotlight. Every smile was carefully placed. Every gesture seemed designed to draw attention. As more guests gathered around her, she launched into another story about wedding plans, luxury destinations, and designer fittings. The audience rewarded her with admiration. It was exactly the response she expected. Then her eyes landed on Claire again. The sight seemed to irritate her. Claire was doing absolutely nothing remarkable. She was simply standing beside Melissa, speaking quietly while looking out at the city lights beyond the windows. Somehow that calmness appeared to bother Vanessa more than any confrontation could have. Vanessa excused herself from the group and began walking across the ballroom. Several people noticed immediately. Conversations softened. Curiosity spread. Melissa saw her approaching and sighed quietly. "Here we go." Claire followed her gaze. Vanessa arrived wearing a pleasant smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Claire," she said warmly. "I was hoping I would get a chance to say hello." Claire offered a polite nod. "Hello, Vanessa. It has been a long time." "It has." Vanessa glanced around at the surrounding guests. Several had already begun pretending not to listen. "I must say, I admire your confidence." Claire remained silent. Vanessa continued. "Events like this can be difficult after, well, everything." The pause was deliberate. Melissa folded her arms. "I think Claire is doing just fine." Vanessa laughed softly. "Oh, I am sure she is." She turned back toward Claire. "I only meant that some people would find it uncomfortable attending a place filled with reminders of the past." Claire held her gaze steadily. "Fortunately, I am not one of those people." For a brief second, surprise flickered across Vanessa's face. She had expected discomfort, perhaps even embarrassment. Instead, she found composure. The response left her without an easy opening. Still, she pressed forward. "That is good, because Ethan and I are announcing some exciting news very soon." Claire simply nodded. "Congratulations." The answer landed with unexpected finality. No jealousy, no visible reaction, nothing Vanessa could use. Around them, several guests exchanged confused glances. The conversation was not unfolding according to the script they had anticipated. Vanessa smiled again, though the expression seemed tighter now. "Thank you. We are very happy." "I can see that." Another pause followed. The silence felt heavier than any argument. Vanessa eventually excused herself and returned to Ethan's side. As she walked away, Melissa released a breath she had been holding. That woman was practically begging for a reaction. Claire looked down at the sparkling water in her hand. Tiny bubbles drifted toward the surface. Then it is probably disappointing that she did not get one. Across the ballroom, Ethan quietly asked Vanessa what had been said. She answered with a dismissive shrug, but her expression remained troubled. Something about Claire's calm confidence no longer made sense. And as the evening continued, more than one person in the room began to wonder the same thing. The evening continued moving forward, but the atmosphere around Claire had changed in ways that were difficult to explain. The whispers had not disappeared. If anything, they had become quieter, more cautious. People were no longer simply amused by her presence. They were curious. Curiosity was far more powerful than ridicule. Claire could feel it every time someone glanced in her direction and quickly looked away. Near the ballroom stage, event organizers were making final preparations for the evening's main presentation. A large screen displayed information about charitable initiatives and upcoming investment partnerships. Guests gradually drifted toward the center of the room. Conversations shifted away from social gossip and toward business opportunities. Ethan welcomed the change. Business was familiar territory. Business was predictable. Unlike Claire, he stood with a small circle of executives discussing market trends and expansion plans, but his attention continued drifting toward the woman he had once known better than anyone. The strange part was that he no longer felt certain he knew her at all. 3 years ago, Claire would never have attended an event like this alone. She would have hated the attention. She would have avoided confrontation at all costs. Yet tonight she carried herself with a quiet confidence that seemed entirely unfamiliar. Vanessa noticed his distraction again. "You are doing it." Ethan looked at her. "Doing what?" "Thinking about her." Ethan immediately shook his head. "No." Vanessa smiled thinly. "Then stop looking." The answer irritated him more than he expected. Before he could respond, the master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage and welcomed everyone to the annual gala. Applause filled the ballroom. Crystal glasses caught the light like tiny stars. The presentation began. Claire listened politely, though her attention wandered. Every few minutes, she found herself glancing toward the entrance. The message from earlier echoed quietly in her mind. "I am almost there." Melissa eventually leaned closer. "You keep looking at the doors." Claire smiled faintly. "Do I?" "You do." Melissa studied her face for a moment. "Who are you waiting for?" Claire lowered her eyes briefly. "Someone important." Melissa laughed softly. "Now I am definitely curious." Before Claire could answer, another wave of applause rolled through the room as the presentation concluded. The master of ceremonies returned to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, before we continue with tonight's program, we would like to recognize a few distinguished guests who have supported this event over the years." Names were announced. Donors stood briefly. Polite applause followed. Then the speaker paused. The pause was subtle, but it immediately captured attention. "And of course, we are honored that one of our most influential supporters may be joining us later this evening." A ripple moved through the audience. Ethan straightened slightly. Vanessa's eyes widened. Around the ballroom, conversation stopped. Everyone knew exactly who was being referenced. No name was necessary. The anticipation alone was enough. The speaker smiled. "If he arrives, I believe many of you will be pleased to meet him." Excitement spread instantly. Ethan exchanged looks with several investors. Opportunities were already being calculated. Introductions imagined. Futures negotiated. Across the room, Claire quietly looked down at her phone. The screen illuminated. A new message had appeared. This time it contained only 4 words. 5 minutes. "See you soon." Claire stared at the message. Then she slipped the phone back into her clutch and lifted her eyes toward the ballroom entrance once more. Her heartbeat remained steady, but somewhere deep inside, she knew the evening was about to change. 5 minutes. The words lingered in Claire's mind as the ballroom noise faded into the background. For a moment, she barely heard the conversations around her. Instead, her thoughts drifted backward through the years, toward a version of herself she almost no longer recognized. There had been a time when Ethan Walker was the center of her world. Back then, everything about him seemed larger than life. His confidence filled every room. His ambition felt magnetic. When they first met at a fundraising event nearly a decade earlier, Claire had been working as a junior curator at a small art gallery on the north side of Chicago. Ethan was already building a reputation in finance. He had spoken about the future with such certainty that listening to him felt like standing in sunlight. He knew exactly where he was going. More importantly, he made Claire believe she would be part of that future. Their early years had felt almost effortless. Weekend trips along Lake Michigan, long dinners at neighborhood restaurants, late-night conversations about dreams and possibilities. Ethan often told her she was the one person who truly understood him. Claire believed him. When he proposed beneath a canopy of lights during a holiday festival downtown, she said yes without hesitation. The years that followed brought success. Ethan's company expanded rapidly. New clients arrived. New opportunities appeared. Their townhouse grew larger. Their social circle became more exclusive. Invitations filled the calendar. At first, Claire viewed the changes as proof that their shared sacrifices were paying off. She supported every late night at the office, every business trip, every postponed vacation, every missed anniversary dinner explained by another important meeting. She told herself that success required patience. The shift happened so gradually that she barely noticed it at first. Ethan stopped asking for her opinion. Then he stopped sharing details altogether. Conversations that once lasted hours became brief exchanges squeezed between phone calls and emails. Somewhere along the way, she stopped feeling like a partner and started feeling like an accessory to a life moving faster than she could follow. Yet she kept trying. She hosted events, smiled through introductions, remembered names, supported causes she barely cared about because they mattered to Ethan. Every time she felt the distance growing between them, she convinced herself that things would improve once the next project ended or the next goal was achieved. The next goal never stopped arriving. Looking back, the warning signs seemed painfully obvious. The way Ethan began checking his phone during conversations. The way he praised ambition in everyone except her. The subtle disappointment that appeared whenever she spoke about her own interests. None of it happened overnight. It happened one small moment at a time until the marriage she thought she was protecting barely resembled the one she had fallen in love with. Standing beneath the ballroom chandeliers years later, Claire finally understood something she had been unable to see back then. She had spent far too much energy trying to hold together a future that only one person was fighting for. And while the memory still carried traces of sadness, it no longer carried regret. Because the woman she had been was gone. And the woman standing here tonight was waiting for an entirely different future to walk through those doors. The end had not arrived with a dramatic confrontation. That was what surprised Claire most when she thought about it now. For years she had imagined that if her marriage ever collapsed, there would be some unmistakable moment, some undeniable event that changed everything. Instead, it happened quietly, like a crack spreading beneath ice. Invisible until the entire surface gave way. It began with small absences. Ethan staying later at the office. Business trips becoming more frequent. Phone calls taken behind closed doors. Claire noticed the changes but ignored the unease growing in her chest. She trusted him. Trust had always been the foundation of their relationship, or at least she believed it was. Then came the excuses. Missed dinners. Forgotten plans. Empty apologies delivered with distracted smiles. Whenever she expressed concern, Ethan reassured her that the company needed him, that the pressure was temporary, that everything he was doing was for their future. Claire wanted to believe him, so she did. The truth arrived on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. There were no flashing warning signs, no dramatic discovery, just a charity luncheon downtown where Claire happened to overhear two women discussing Ethan and Vanessa as if their relationship were common knowledge. Claire still remembered standing motionless beside a table covered with white roses while their voices drifted through the room. They spoke casually, carelessly, assuming no one important was listening. By the time the conversation ended, Claire felt as though the floor beneath her had disappeared. At first she convinced herself there had to be some misunderstanding. Vanessa worked with several of Ethan's largest clients. Professional relationships were often misinterpreted. But deep down, she already knew. The signs she had ignored suddenly arranged themselves into a pattern she could no longer deny. That evening, Ethan came home after 9 o'clock. Claire asked a simple question. One question. She never forgot the silence that followed. It lasted only seconds, yet somehow felt endless. Ethan did not deny it. He did not argue. He did not even appear surprised that she had figured it out. The calmness in his expression hurt more than any explanation could have. Looking back, that was the moment something inside her broke. Not because another woman existed, not because the marriage was ending, but because she realized how long she had been fighting for something Ethan had already abandoned. The months that followed felt like moving through fog. Lawyers, meetings, documents, conversations reduced to logistics. People chose sides. Friends disappeared. Invitations stopped arriving. Ethan moved forward with astonishing speed, while Claire struggled simply to understand what had happened. For a long time, she blamed herself. She wondered whether she had been too quiet, too trusting, not ambitious enough. The questions haunted her for months. Then, eventually, a different realization emerged. The failure of the marriage had never been about her worth. It had been about Ethan's choices. Understanding that truth did not erase the pain, but it gave her something she desperately needed: freedom. Standing in the ballroom years later, Claire slowly exhaled. The memories still existed. They always would, yet they no longer controlled her. Across the room, Ethan laughed at something an investor had said. The sound carried through the crowd. Once it would have pulled her backward into the past. Tonight it barely held her attention, because somewhere beyond the ballroom doors, the future was getting closer with every passing minute. Rebuilding a life sounded inspiring when people talked about it afterward. They described resilience as though it were something elegant, something noble. Claire knew better. Rebuilding was messy. It was lonely. It was waking up in a quiet apartment and realizing there was no longer anyone beside you. It was staring at a future you never planned for and somehow finding the strength to walk into it anyway. The first year after the divorce had been the hardest. The townhouse was gone. The social calendar vanished. Friends she had known for years slowly disappeared, revealing that many of those relationships had been tied to Ethan rather than to her. At first, the silence felt unbearable. She filled it with work. The small art gallery where she had once started her career welcomed her back. The position was modest compared to the lifestyle she had left behind, but for the first time in years the work felt meaningful. She spent her days surrounded by paintings, sculptures, and artists who cared more about creativity than status. Slowly, she began remembering pieces of herself that had been buried beneath years of compromise. She enrolled in professional certification programs. She attended lectures. She rebuilt her reputation one project at a time. There were setbacks. There were nights when exhaustion followed her home. There were moments when she questioned whether she was truly moving forward or simply learning how to survive disappointment. Yet every challenge taught her something important. She was stronger than she had ever believed. One winter evening, nearly 18 months after the divorce, Claire stood alone inside a small gallery after closing. Hours. Snow drifted outside the windows while soft music played through the speakers. She had just completed her first major exhibition as lead curator. The event had been successful. Clients were impressed. New opportunities were emerging. As she locked the front door, she caught her reflection in the glass. For a moment, she barely recognized the woman staring back at her. Not because she looked different, because she looked certain. That realization changed everything. Success arrived gradually after that. New projects, new partnerships, growing respect within the art community. Claire stopped measuring her life against the one she had lost. She began building something entirely her own. Back in the ballroom, she looked around at the people who once seemed so important. The executives, the investors, the socialites chasing influence. Years ago, their opinions would have carried enormous weight. Tonight, they felt distant, almost irrelevant. Melissa noticed the thoughtful expression on her face. "Where did you just go?" she asked with a smile. Claire laughed softly. "A long way from here." Before Melissa could respond, movement near the entrance drew attention once again. This time the reaction was different. Conversations paused immediately. Several guests straightened. Others exchanged surprised looks. Even Ethan stopped speaking in the middle of a sentence. The shift moved through the ballroom like an invisible current. Claire felt it too. Her pulse quickened slightly. Not from fear, from recognition. She did not need to see who had arrived. Somehow she already knew. Across the room, heads turned toward the entrance in unison. And for the first time all evening, the entire ballroom fell completely silent. Every conversation in the ballroom seemed to stop at once. The silence was subtle at first, like a wave pulling away from shore before anyone noticed the tide changing. Then heads began turning, one after another. Investors, executives, donors, socialites. People who had spent the entire evening trying to be noticed suddenly forgot about themselves and focused on the entrance. Ethan felt it immediately. The reaction was impossible to ignore. He turned toward the doors along with everyone else. A tall figure had just entered the ballroom, accompanied by only a small security detail that remained respectfully behind him. There was nothing flashy about his arrival. No grand announcement. No dramatic entrance. Yet the effect was undeniable. Alexander Sterling carried the kind of presence that could not be manufactured. The kind built through decades of success, discipline, and quiet influence. Conversations that had filled financial magazines for years suddenly felt very real. Ethan had seen photographs before, interviews, articles, market analyses. None of them fully captured the reality of the man standing 20 yards away. Alexander moved calmly through the ballroom, acknowledging greetings with polite nods. People immediately began repositioning themselves, searching for opportunities to be introduced. Several executives abandoned conversations mid-sentence. Others straightened their jackets and rehearsed smiles. Vanessa's eyes widened. "Oh my God," she whispered. Ethan was already calculating possibilities. If he could secure even 5 minutes of conversation tonight, the opportunity alone could transform several pending business negotiations. Near the windows, Melissa quietly looked toward Claire. Something about her friend's expression had changed. Not excitement, not surprise, recognition. Melissa frowned slightly. "You knew he was coming." Claire kept her eyes on the entrance. "I had a feeling." The answer was technically true, though far from complete. Memories surfaced unexpectedly. 2 years earlier, Claire had attended a private exhibition opening in New York. The gallery had featured emerging artists from across the country. She had spent months helping curate the collection. Near the end of the evening, she found herself speaking with a quiet guest who seemed more interested in the artwork than the publicity surrounding it. They talked for nearly 40 minutes about creativity, history, and purpose. Only afterward had she learned his name, Alexander Sterling. Most people treated his attention like a prize. He treated conversations like they mattered. That difference alone had surprised her. The months that followed brought occasional meetings, then friendships, then something deeper neither of them expected. He never tried to rescue her, never treated her like someone broken. Instead, he listened, encouraged, challenged, respected. Piece by piece, trust returned to places where disappointment had once lived. Back in the ballroom, Alexander continued moving through the crowd. Ethan noticed several influential investors gathering around him almost immediately. Yet Alexander appeared completely unhurried, uninterested in performing for the room. Then something unexpected happened. His gaze shifted across the ballroom, past the executives, past the donors, past the people competing for his attention, directly toward Claire. The distance between them was considerable, yet the moment felt strangely intimate. Claire smiled. It was not the careful smile she had worn all evening, not the polite smile reserved for strangers. This one was effortless, genuine. Melissa noticed immediately. So did Ethan. And for reasons he could not explain, a sudden feeling of unease settled heavily in his chest as Alexander Sterling began walking in their direction. The distance between the entrance and the windows could not have been more than 40 feet, yet it seemed to stretch across the entire ballroom. Every eye followed Alexander Sterling as he moved through the crowd. People stepped aside instinctively. Some smiled hopefully. Others attempted brief introductions. He acknowledged them politely, but never slowed his pace. Ethan watched the scene unfold with growing confusion. It made no sense. Men like Alexander did not cross crowded rooms without purpose. They were usually the destination, not the traveler. Yet Alexander appeared focused on a single point ahead of him. Claire. The realization settled heavily in Ethan's stomach. Beside him, Vanessa noticed it too. "Why is he walking over there?" she whispered. Ethan did not answer. He was too busy trying to convince himself that he was mistaken. Across the ballroom, Melissa's eyes widened. "Claire," she said quietly, "please tell me I am imagining this." Claire laughed softly. It was the first genuinely relaxed laugh she had given all evening. "You are not imagining it." Melissa stared at her. "Who exactly is Alexander Sterling to you?" Before Claire could answer, Alexander reached them. The noise of the ballroom seemed to fade into the background. Up close, he looked exactly as Claire remembered. Calm, composed, confident without needing to prove it. His charcoal suit was impeccably tailored, but nothing about him felt performative. The most remarkable thing about Alexander Sterling had never been his wealth. It was the way he made everyone around him feel seen. His expression softened the moment he looked at Claire. "I am sorry I am late." The simple sentence carried a warmth that immediately caught Melissa's attention. Claire smiled. "You made it. I said I would." For a moment, neither of them seemed aware of the hundreds of people surrounding them. The exchange was effortless, familiar, comfortable, like two people continuing a conversation rather than beginning one. Melissa looked from one to the other in stunned silence. Across the room, Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. He could not remember ever seeing Claire smile that way, not even during the happiest years of their marriage. Nearby guests had stopped pretending not to watch. Whispers spread rapidly. Questions multiplied. How did Claire know Alexander Sterling? Why was he speaking to her as though they were close? Why did he appear completely uninterested in anyone else in the room? Vanessa attempted a laugh. Maybe she curated some artwork for him. The explanation sounded weak even to her own ears. Ethan remained silent. Something deeper was happening. He could feel it. Alexander turned briefly toward Melissa and offered a polite greeting. Then his attention returned to Claire. "Have they been treating you well?" he asked. The question sounded simple, yet Claire understood exactly what he meant. She glanced around the ballroom, at the people who had whispered, at the people who had laughed, at the people who suddenly looked very nervous. "I survived." Alexander's eyes narrowed slightly, not with anger, with understanding. He knew her well enough to hear everything she was choosing not to say. A faint smile touched his lips. "Good." Across the room, the master of ceremonies noticed the gathering crowd and sensed an opportunity. He stepped toward the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, drawing attention back toward the stage. "We are honored that Mr. Alexander Sterling has joined us this evening." Applause erupted immediately, yet Alexander barely acknowledged it. His focus remained on Claire. And for the first time all night, the entire ballroom began to realize that the most important story in the room had nothing to do with business. Applause echoed through the ballroom, but it gradually faded as people realized Alexander Sterling had no intention of moving toward the stage. The master of ceremonies stood awkwardly beside the microphone, smiling uncertainly while guests shifted their attention back to the far more interesting scene unfolding near the windows. Claire could feel hundreds of eyes resting on her. Only a few hours earlier, those same eyes had viewed her with amusement, curiosity, or pity. Now they were filled with questions. Alexander seemed completely unaffected by the attention. He glanced toward the stage, offered a polite nod to the host, and then looked back at Claire. "There is something I have been meaning to do," he said. Melissa immediately sensed the change in his tone. Around them, conversation slowed again. Even the musicians appeared to lower the volume of their performance. Across the ballroom, Ethan instinctively took a step forward. Vanessa touched his arm. "What is happening?" she whispered. Ethan did not answer. His eyes never left Claire. Alexander reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. The motion was simple, but it instantly captured the attention of everyone watching. Claire already knew what was coming. They had spoken about it weeks earlier. They had planned a private celebration with close friends and family. Nothing extravagant, nothing public. That had always been Alexander's preference. Yet life rarely followed plans. And after everything Claire had endured tonight, he seemed to have reached a decision of his own. He withdrew a small velvet box. The sight of it sent a ripple through the crowd. Melissa's hand flew to her mouth. Across the room, Vanessa's smile disappeared entirely. Ethan felt the blood drain from his face. Alexander looked directly at Claire. The ballroom seemed to shrink until there was only the two of them standing beneath the golden chandelier light. "For a long time," he said quietly, "you believed your value depended on whether someone else could see it. You spent years giving your loyalty, your kindness, and your strength to people who did not deserve them." Claire felt emotion tighten in her chest. Alexander continued, "The remarkable thing is that none of it changed who you are. You remained generous. You remained brave. You remained yourself." Not a single person in the ballroom spoke. Alexander opened the velvet box. Inside rested a diamond ring that caught the light and scattered it across the room. Several guests gasped softly. "The luckiest moment of my life was meeting you," he said. "And the easiest decision I have ever made was choosing a future with you." Claire smiled, through eyes shimmering with emotion. She had spent years rebuilding her confidence. Yet hearing those words still touched places inside her that had once been wounded. Alexander took her hand gently. Then he turned toward the crowd. His voice remained calm, but every word carried effortlessly through the silent ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, I would like you to meet my fiancée, Claire Bennett." The silence that followed was absolute. No one laughed. No one whispered. For several long seconds, the entire room simply stared. Melissa looked as though she had forgotten how to breathe. Vanessa stood frozen. Ethan could only watch, because in a single moment, every assumption he had made about Claire had shattered. And for the first time all evening, he finally understood why she had never seemed afraid. For several seconds after Alexander's announcement, the ballroom remained suspended in stunned silence. It was the kind of silence that only appeared when an entire room realized it had been completely wrong. Then the whispers began, quiet at first, then spreading rapidly from one conversation to the next. Claire could hear fragments drifting through the crowd. Questions, disbelief, shock. People who had spent the evening treating her like a forgotten chapter were suddenly trying to reconcile the woman they thought they knew with the reality standing before them. Alexander remained beside her, his hand gently holding hers. There was no arrogance in his expression, no desire to prove anything. He simply looked proud, proud to stand next to her, proud for the world to finally see what he had seen all along. Melissa was the first to recover. "You have been engaged this entire time?" she asked, still sounding breathless. Claire laughed softly. "For a few weeks. And you never told me? We were planning to announce it next month." Melissa shook her head in disbelief. "Next month is not tonight." Nearby, several guests who had avoided Claire earlier were suddenly eager to introduce themselves again. Smiles appeared. Compliments followed. The transformation would have been amusing if it were not so predictable. Across the room, Vanessa struggled to maintain her composure. The confidence that had carried her through the evening had disappeared completely. She looked around and realized the attention she had worked so hard to attract was gone. Every conversation now centered on Claire. Every glance, every question, every expression of admiration. The spotlight had shifted, and there was nothing she could do to reclaim it. Ethan remained motionless. The scene unfolding before him felt strangely unreal. He remembered the years after the divorce, the assumptions he had made, the stories he had accepted without question. Somewhere in his mind, Claire had remained frozen as the woman he left behind. He had never imagined she would build a life entirely beyond his reach. Yet standing beside Alexander Sterling, she looked more confident than he had ever seen her. More at peace, more herself. As the realization settled over him, another uncomfortable truth followed close behind. She had not needed him to become this woman. She never had. The master of ceremonies eventually approached with a nervous smile. "Mr. Sterling, Miss Bennett, allow me to offer my congratulations." Applause followed. This time it spread throughout the ballroom. Genuine. Enthusiastic. Claire felt emotion rise unexpectedly in her chest. Not because of the applause, not because of the attention, but because she remembered the woman she had once been. The woman who questioned her worth. The woman who believed rejection defined her value. That woman would never have imagined a night like this. Alexander leaned slightly closer. "Are you all right?" Claire looked around the ballroom one final time. At the chandeliers, the city lights beyond the windows, the faces that had changed so dramatically in a matter of minutes. Then she looked at him. "I am better than all right." Alexander smiled. And across the room, Ethan finally lowered his eyes, understanding that the greatest thing he had lost was never the marriage itself. It was the woman standing beside someone who truly knew her worth. The gala continued long after the surprise had settled over the room. But for Claire, the evening had already reached its true conclusion. The applause faded. Conversations resumed. Guests returned to their tables carrying a story they would discuss for months. Yet none of that mattered as much as the quiet sense of peace growing inside her. She stood beside Alexander near the windows overlooking the Chicago skyline. Below them, thousands of lights stretched across the city like stars scattered along the earth. For years she had imagined what it would feel like to face the people who once judged her. She had imagined clever responses, perfect explanations, moments of vindication. The reality was very different. She discovered she no longer needed any of those things. The greatest victory was not proving anyone wrong. It was no longer needing their approval. Across the ballroom, Ethan remained surrounded by people, yet somehow looked more alone than he had all evening. Several investors approached him. Conversations resumed. Business continued. Life moved forward. But every now and then his gaze drifted toward Claire and Alexander. Not with anger, not even with jealousy, with understanding. For the first time, he seemed to recognize that the woman he had underestimated had become someone extraordinary long before tonight. The only difference was that now, everyone else could see it too. Vanessa eventually excused herself from a conversation and quietly left the ballroom. No dramatic scene followed. No confrontation. The spotlight she had spent the evening chasing had simply moved on. Claire felt no satisfaction in that. Only indifference. Some chapters closed naturally when people stopped giving them power. Melissa joined Claire one last time before the evening ended. "I still cannot believe you kept this secret from me," she said with a laugh. Claire smiled. "I wanted it to be real before I talked about it." Melissa glanced at Alexander. "I would say it is very real." After Melissa walked away, Alexander offered Claire his arm. "Ready to go home?" The question was simple, yet it touched something deep within her. Home. For years that word had been attached to places, addresses, and memories. Now it felt attached to peace, to trust, to the future waiting ahead. Claire slipped her hand into his. Together they walked toward the ballroom exit. The crowd naturally parted as they passed. Some guests smiled. Others nodded respectfully. A few looked embarrassed by how they had treated her earlier. Claire acknowledged them with quiet grace. She carried no desire for revenge. Life had already delivered the only answer she needed. Near the doors, she paused briefly and looked back across the room one final time. The chandeliers glowed softly overhead. Laughter echoed through the ballroom. The same room that had welcomed her with whispers now watched her leave with admiration. Yet the most remarkable thing was how little that change mattered. Because her worth had never depended on their opinions. It never had. Alexander squeezed her hand gently. Claire smiled and turned toward the future. Then, together, they stepped through the doors and disappeared into the Chicago night. Behind them remained a ballroom full of people who had learned a lesson they would not soon forget. And ahead of them stretched a new chapter built not on status, wealth, or appearances, but on respect, trust, and love. Ethan had no idea that this would be the last time he would ever see Claire as part of his past. But Claire knew, and that quiet certainty was worth more than any victory the room could have offered.